Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to see everybody here, and welcome to the 2018 World Cherry Lecture, which is to be delivered by the extraordinary Mr. Bovell, or Dr. Bovell, I have to call you now, right? Yeah. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name's Tom Healy. I'm a lecturer in drama in the Drama Centre here at Flinders University, and I'm emceeing tonight. So it falls to me to do the announcements about toilets. That's about as highbrow as I get this evening. So for those of you who don't know, there are toilets just out that main door there and to the left. And also, in case of Andrew starting some kind of psychic or even real fire in the room, going out that door is one exit point, and there's another one right around the back, around the bar. So if there's an emergency, you know where to head. There's also a lift just outside the main door and to the right, and I don't know why, but Flinders University have asked me to tell you to be careful when exiting the event tonight. I really don't understand that point, but, you know, I said I'd say it. So before we welcome this evening's distinguished speaker, I'm going to invite Professor Peter Monteith to give us a welcome to country. Thanks, Peter.
Nyadlu tampanti, gana miyana, yata matanya, wama tandanyaku. Those are words from the Ghana language, and they mean we recognise that the Ghana people are the landowners and custodians of the Adelaide Plains. I'd like to add to that also that I pay my respects to their leaders past and present. As you've heard, my name's Peter Monteith. I'm the Acting Dean of Research in the College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences. I'd like to welcome all of you here this evening to attend the World Cherry Lecture. This is a lecture that's been held since 2006. It's given in honour of World Cherry, who was a foundation professor here at Flinders University. And the lecture gives staff, students, friends of the university the opportunity to hear words of wisdom from a number of people, but often directors, producers, writers, actors, and tonight is no exception. So it's a great pleasure to be able to welcome Dr. Andrew Bovell to deliver the 2018 World Cherry Lecture. The lecture is an indicator of the passion we have in our faculty and in the university generally for the creative and the performing arts. We're very proud of what we do in creative and performing arts at the university, both in teaching and in research. We're very proud of our graduates who go on to pursue careers in many different roles in that field in South Australia, in Australia, and indeed in the wider world. So I welcome all of you very warmly to this event, and I extend the university's thanks to you for being here this evening. And my job now is to pass over to Stephen Gerlach, AM, the Chancellor of Flinders University, to introduce to you tonight's speaker. Please, Stephen.
Thank you very much for that introduction, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Flinders University and the College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences, it is my pleasure to welcome you here this evening to this annual World Cherry Lecture, to be delivered by our guest speaker, Dr. Andrew Bovell. I'm actually very interested to actually have the opportunity to actually make this introduction, because when I first became the Chancellor here at Flinders University just over 8 years ago, in the first week or so, not knowing a lot about the university, but one of the first things that I started to hear was something about Wal Cherry and what he had done for the university historically around the creative arts. And so I've lived my last 8 years or so with my involvement in Flinders University with this recurring theme about Wal Cherry, and I've never actually had an opportunity to speak about him. So I'm going to fix that tonight. And in my own introduction, I'm just going to say, and I would like to say just a few things about that, what that journey was for him, and why we're here tonight, and why we've been able to, as a university, attract such world-famous people as our speaker tonight to this particular Wal Cherry lecture. So, the drama program here at Flinders University started in 1967. It was just after right. I'd like to be 7 foot tall, but I'm not. It was established at Flinders University in 1967, which was actually the year after the university started. And he became the foundation professor of drama. He worked hard to establish the department integrating the teaching of theatre, film, radio and television. But he was also impatient with those owing their eminence to the flatness of what he described as the surrounding countryside. Cherry was a provocative figure and was often kept at a distance by the acting profession of his day. So his hope to develop major links between the drama program and a key professional theatre company was not to be. He continued working both at the university in a variety of roles. We right? Can you hear me? Right. In a variety of roles, professionally as a director until 1978, when in 1980 he was appointed Professor of Theatre at Temple University in Philadelphia and later Associate Director of the Boston Shakespeare Company, and then unfortunately soon after he died. Wal's daughters, Kate and Anna, have continued in their father's footsteps in the arts, and Kate Cherry was last year appointed the CEO of NIDA. So she's had a very distinguished career too. Flinders University has continued to foster artistic achievement through our creative arts program. The drama program was only the second one to be offered at an Australian university. The Drama Centre was established in 1972 and has provided practical training at the undergraduate and postgraduate levels for generations of students with skills in theatre, film, television and now digital media. Many of our alumni have established remarkable and influential creative careers. Brink Productions, The Border Project, Circus Oz, Red Shed and The Angels are amongst the many stellar success stories to emerge from the university. Our graduates include actors such as Noni Hazelhurst, Xavier Samuel, directors Scott Hicks and Andrew Morass, and writers Hannah Kent and Mem Fox. Locally, a lot of you will know Douglas Gautier, Peter Gers, the list goes on of people that in various forms of the arts have made a significant name for themselves. This is really just a small snippet of the impact that started with that first drama course under the guidance of Professor Cherry. And I'm happy to say that one of the major strategic focuses of the areas in which this university is going to continue to develop is in relation to the whole question of the creative arts. It is high on our agenda of things to focus on, and we think it is really important for this university and a differentiator for it. This week is also an important one in the university calendar. Graduations are special milestones for the hundreds of students who are receiving their degrees. Amongst them today with our guest speaker, Andrew Bovell. Andrew is one of Australia's finest writers and storytellers. He was born in Western Australia in 1962 and graduated from the University of Western Australia with a Bachelor of Arts followed by a diploma in dramatic arts at the Victorian College of the Arts in Melbourne. And he began writing in the late 1980s and was writer-in-residence at the Melbourne Workers' Theatre. His work as a playwright and scriptwriter includes some of our best-loved stories, such as Strictly Ballroom and Lantana. Along the way, he has also garnered much praise and a number of awards for his work. His play Who's Afraid of the Working Class won the 1999 Orgy Best Stage Play, Victorian Green Room Award and the Queensland Premier's Literary Award. Holy Day was awarded the Victorian Premier's Literary Award and the Orgy Stage Award in 2002. When the Rain Stops Falling won the Queensland Premier's Literary Award, the Victorian Premier's Literary Award, the Victorian Green Room Award, the Orgy Stage Award and the Sydney Theatre Award for Best New Australian Work. It goes on. In 2001, he was awarded a Centenary Medal for his services to the arts, and in 2015 he was the first Australian screenwriter to be invited to deliver the British Academy of Film and Television Arts and the British Film Industry International Screenwriting Lecture. He also follows in Professor Cherry's footsteps of pushing the boundaries, asking the radical questions, and thinking about big ideas. In acknowledgement of his many achievements, Flinders University has today awarded him an Honorary Doctorate of Letters, and we welcome him into the Flinders family and our long-established tradition of excellence in the field of creative arts. So, ladies and gentlemen, enough of me. Allow me to introduce to you our speaker of this evening, Mr. Andrew Bovell, and I understand his topic is the Holy Day Revisited. Thank you, Andrew.
Good. Something significant happened in our country last year. Representatives of the First Nations peoples issued what will become one of the great defining documents of our nation, the Uluru Statement from the Heart. It is a beautifully conceived document that should be read in its entirety, but to quote the concluding paragraph here. In 1967, we were counted. In 2017, we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our trek across this vast country. We invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. To the dismay of many, this generous and important invitation was declined by our then Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull. It was a missed opportunity of enormous consequence. It could have defined his prime ministership. As it turns out, his leadership of this country is entirely forgettable. Nor does it seem likely that the man who replaced him, Scott Morrison, will seek to make this right. Rather than hearing the words and accepting the advice of the authors of this considered statement, Mr. Morrison has sent an envoy instead, as if to another country. Perhaps he has taken Machiavelli's advice to send your enemies away to a foreign place before they can make trouble at home. But what does Mr. Morrison hope to hear from Mr. Abbott when the First Nations people themselves, the First Nations people of this country, have already so eloquently expressed what is needed for us to move forward? These men are on the wrong side of history. They have failed to understand the moral weight and political urgency of the document, and they have failed to understand that the views it expresses will prevail. This missed opportunity, this political failure, redraws the line in the sand that continues to divide this country between those who value what existed before the arrival of Europeans and seek to place it at the centre of our identity, and those who deny it, between those who embrace the bold vision for the country, as articulated in the Uluru Statement, and those who remain fearful of it and cling to a version of Australia that reveals us as a paler shade of Britain. These two sides are engaged in a battle for the soul of the nation. It has always been the case, and the stakes feel as high as they have ever been. It is this battle, this struggle, that I sought to write about 20 years ago in Holiday. I wrote about the violence from which the white nation was forged and the silence which descended over our history as a result. The subject of this lecture is whether I would do so in the same way now, given the questions which have been raised about identity and privilege, about access and platforms, about trauma and lived experience, and about who gets to tell the story of this country of ours. Do I, as a white man of relative privilege, have anything to offer on the subject, or should I retreat from this space in favour of other voices that speak with other perspectives and from other experiences? I've reflected deeply on this, particularly since adapting Kate Grenville's novel, The Secret River, for the stage. It has prompted me to re-look at Holiday and to consider the playwright I was then and the changes in the terrain in which I have written for the past 30 years. But let me begin with a more recent work, set in our own times and located just a stone's throw from where we stand in the suburb of Hallett Cove. Things I Know to Be True tells the story of the Price family. The play unfolds through the 4 seasons of the year as each of 4 adult children go through a crisis of identity. The emphasis of the drama is not so much on each of these 4 crises, but on the impact they have upon the parents, Bob and Fran. How each crisis in turn challenges their values and forces them to question the life they have worked so hard to create. For me, the play is about class. To be specific, it's about the generational transformation of the Australian working class to an aspirational middle class. Fran is a nurse who works at Flinders Hospital, and Bob was retrenched from the Mitsubishi assembly plant where he had worked since he was a young man. It's very much a southern suburbs kind of play. And yet the specificity of its setting gives way to themes that are universal and have proved as relevant to the suburbs of Leeds and Colchester and London and Milwaukee and Tucson and Madrid as they are to the suburbs of Adelaide. It is the story of working class parents who have worked hard in relatively low-paid jobs to ensure that their children have more choices than they had. The irony is that the choices their children end up making leave their parents behind. In one particularly emotional scene, Fran says to her eldest son, Mark, "We spoilt you, you and your sister. We brought you up to think that you can have what you want. You can be what you want, no matter what the cost or who it hurts. People like us, your father and me, think the mugs we are, we're just the people we were told to be. And who was I told to be? A mother? Well, I wish I'd never had children." The play premiered in 2016 at the State Theatre Company at the Playhouse. It was co-directed by Geordie Brookman and Scott Graham from UK company Frantic Assembly. The production subsequently opened in London at the Lyric Hammersmith and toured the UK, and it will be seen in a new production at Belvoir Street next year, directed by Neil Armfield. It is in no sense autobiographical, but it is perhaps the most personal play I have written. It is about the resilience of a long-term marriage. It's about loving too much and not loving enough and trying to find the right place in between. It's about holding on to your children when they need to be held and letting them go before they start to squirm. As I said, the play unfolds over 4 seasons of a year, and in each season, each child goes through a particular crisis. In summer, youngest daughter Rosie returns from Europe, having had her heart broken by a handsome boy from Spain, and realises that she's not ready for the world yet. In autumn, eldest daughter Pip chooses to leave her marriage and children to pursue a professional opportunity and a more fulfilling relationship overseas. In winter, eldest son Mark shocks his parents when he tells them that he identifies as female and plans to leave Adelaide to begin a new life as Mia in Sydney. And in spring, youngest son Ben reveals that he has been stealing from his employer in order to sustain an aspirational lifestyle he could never really afford. One ungenerous critic, and there is always one, suggested that so much drama could never happen to one family in a single year. Maybe that's true, but he's missed the point. My work often employs a structural conceit that pushes the boundaries of credulity in order to deliberately place its characters under emotional stress, emotional duress. A play is like a petri dish. You create the right conditions and see what grows. And so the shape of the work defines it. 4 seasons in a year, and in each season the focus shifts to each of 4 children in turn. Form and content, if you like. This is about transition and change and the continuity of the cycle of life. But my focus for the purpose of this lecture is on the story of Mark, or Mia as she becomes. I wanted to be normal mum, whatever that is. I wanted to grow up, get married and have my own kids, just like you and Dad. I wanted to love and be loved. That's all I ever wanted. And later, in the same scene, as the emotional heat rises, she says to her mother, if you want to have a relationship with me in the future, you need to know that the space in between black and white is much wider than you have ever imagined. And Fran, fierce and frightening in her response, I have been a nurse for 30 years. I have seen all sorts of in-between. I have wiped the arses and tended the wounds of men who have been women and women who have been men. So I know what this looks like. But here, now, I am a mother. And I'm losing something I don't want to lose. That boy, the one we raised, your father and me, that man, what happens to him? Do we even get to say goodbye? Later in the play, Mia describes leaving Adelaide to begin her new life. The plane turns down the runway, increases its speed, lifts off the ground, and as it makes its ascent, I look down upon the city where I grew up and steel myself against memories, against history, and against the man I was. By the time I land in Sydney, Mark Price will just be someone I used to know. It is an emotional scene. It's an emotional play. It takes its audience through some harrowing scenes of family conflict and loss. I'm still moved by Mia's final embrace with her father at the airport as they both realise that this is the last time they will embrace as father and son. Bob can barely speak. He can barely stand it. He won't let her go. She has to prise his fingers away. My father's grief is a price I'm prepared to pay, she says. She feels such an anticipation for her life as a woman and yet also grief for the man she has to cast aside in order to live as that woman. These are complex human dynamics, and it is my curiosity about what it means to be human that leads me to want to write about them. Geordie and Scott's production was wonderful, with a stunning design by Jeff Cobham and 2 brilliant casts in Australia and in the UK. Understandably, there was a degree of sensitivity in how we approached the character of Mark Mia. Stephanie Russell and Rebecca Root, both trans women, worked closely with the respective productions, particularly with the 2 actors who played the role, Tim Walter in Australia and Matthew Barker in the UK. Both actors identify as cis males. I had deliberately chosen not to tell the story of Mia's transition or to depict her life as a woman. I knew that this was territory that was best covered by someone who had a more direct or closer relationship to the subject. In this play, the focus was on the impact Mark's decision to identify as a woman had on her parents. Nevertheless, some trans people argue that they don't want their lives, their experiences, used as the dramatic problem in the dominant heteronormative narrative, unless they are in control of that narrative. The trans character or the queer character or the black character has historically been the tragic figure or the problematic figure in the heteronormative audience is meant to feel sorry for. And in our capacity for empathy, reassures us that we are good people, but at whose cost? This criticism has not been made of the play. Mia is not a tragic character. She has agency in this drama. She has made her decision and is depicted as moving positively towards the life she has chosen to lead. But her decision impacts upon the people around her, and the play attempts to deal with that honestly. The play does not provide a lesson in how parents should react to such a revelation. Bob and Fran don't handle it well. It sends them wild with grief. It's a bitter scene and things are said that shouldn't be said between parents and children. It's a train wreck. We see it happening before us, and yet all three characters weather it with dignity. When it played in Canberra, I watched it with my youngest son. He was 20 at the time and studying at ANU. His mum, Eugenia, was playing Fran. It was the first time he had seen his mother performing in a play written by his father, so it was an important moment for us. After, he expressed some disquiet. He liked the play well enough, but in regard to the character of Mark, he said, "I don't know how I feel about it, Dad." "What do you mean?" I said. "Well, it's not really your story to tell, is it? It's not your lived experience." I felt my jaw tighten a little. I immediately wanted to defend the play and the process and to explain how careful I had been, how politically correct and sensitive and informed I am. I also wanted to challenge this notion that a writer can only speak from his or her lived experience. I guess I felt threatened by the implied accusation that I had spoken without authority or authenticity. And maybe I even felt a little bit panicked that there might just be stories that weren't mine to tell, after all, and that the smorgasbord of life's experiences that I'd always helped myself to might not always be available to me. I mean, I get it. I am white, I am male, I am straight, I am cisgender, I am middle class. People like me have always reached the smorgasbord first, and we don't leave much for anyone else. Now someone is saying you can't have the prawns, they're for somebody else. I don't really know where that analogy is going, so I'll leave it there. I wanted to argue the case with my son, but I understood that as a 20-year-old university student, he reflects the views of his generation, and I would be foolish not to listen and to try and understand them. My son's generation thinks differently than my generation about these questions. That's not so unusual. It's healthy. It's healthy to be expected. But at 20, he operates under a different set of assumptions than I did at his age. Something has shifted, and I want to understand it. The ideas that writers should only write from their own lived experience or identities is scaring the hell out of some of us, mainly those of us who are white. Why? What are we scared of? That we have to share the resources, the opportunities, that we can no longer be the ones who know everything and have everything, or that audiences may no longer be interested in what we have to say. In my 20s, I believed that I could tell any story I chose to, or needed to, or was asked to. In fact, I took pride in my capacity to tell the stories of others, particularly the marginalised, the disempowered, the voiceless. I wrote with a sense of social justice and with the intention of exposing the wrongs of the world, like inequality and corruption. This was my training. This was my mission, both at the VCA and the Melbourne Workers' Theatre. Not to tell my story, but to go out into the world and tell the stories of others who, for whatever reason, could not tell their own. Now such an approach seems condescending, and audiences are more interested to hear voices that speak directly from those experiences and not through the lens of white privilege. This tradition is being challenged, and it's not comfortable. This traditional hegemony is being challenged, and it's not comfortable, at least for those who have to relinquish something. power mainly, or relevance perhaps? I think we are broadly familiar with this debate. At one end, there is the idea that writers should have a special dispensation to write across cultures and races and identities and sexualities, that the story is paramount, that the idea is paramount, the writer's voice is paramount, and any form of restriction on this is tantamount to censorship and ideological bullying. This is the position put controversially and deliberately so by Lionel Shriver at the Brisbane Writers' Festival. But she is no means the only writer to hold this view. I think most white writers believe this. And at the other end of the argument is the idea that we can only speak our own story. We can only draw on our own lived experience. So only a trans woman can tell the story of a trans woman. Only a woman of colour can tell the story of a woman of colour. Only a prostitute can tell the story of a prostitute. Only a member of the working class can tell the story of the working class. The problem with this is that we're not all writing monologues, and the stories are often about how people of different identities and from different positions come together for good or bad. And to tell that story, writers must write across identities and within them. If you push this argument to its logical conclusion, then identity does start to act like a restriction, and the tone of the conversation becomes censorious. Those who speak outside of their identities are taken to task on social media. The conversation quickly loses any nuance and becomes vitriolic until everybody becomes afraid to say anything in case they get it wrong, except the bullies who keep on shouting and remain convinced that they are right. I have followed the ongoing controversy around the Horn Essay Prize. For those of you not familiar with it, the organisers of this increasingly prestigious prize introduced a new guideline this year that said essays about experiences of First Nations Australians by non-Indigenous writers would not be accepted. The restriction also applied to essays about the queer community and other minorities. The argument has raged for and against, culminating in the withdrawal of Anna Funder and David Marr as judges. These are prestigious figures in the literary world. In the end, the organisers, the Saturday paper, acquiesced to their critics and lifted the ban, allowing anyone to write on the subject of their choice. So what do I think about this? Can a straight man write about a lesbian relationship? Yes, but a lesbian will probably have a greater insight into the subject. Can a straight man write about the rape of a woman? Yes, but a woman probably has something more interesting to say about it. Can an atheist write about a person of faith? Definitely. Can a person of colour write about a white man? Yes. Can a white man write about a person of colour? Yes. No. Wait. Maybe he can't. Or maybe he just shouldn't. But I have, and I do, and I want to. So, where am I? What am I trying to say? What do I actually think? Thank God I'm not on Twitter. And don't anyone yell at me, please. Because I'm just trying to work this out. Between these two positions, there are actually more nuanced arguments taking place that recognise there are structural biases that allow some writers more access and more opportunities to write, to have their work published or produced, and to range across an unlimited subject area, whilst opportunities have been restricted for others. And when they get the opportunity for their work to be seen or heard, they are expected to remain within their own direct experience. And so women are expected to write primarily about being a woman, and people of colour are expected to write about being a person of colour. Now, they may well choose to do this. This may well be the subject matter, but the point is that white writers, specifically white male writers, have been allowed and encouraged and supported and expected to write across all subjects and to represent all cultures and identities, while others are restricted to the subjects and experiences determined by their identities. I imagine that the organisers of the Horn Prize weren't particularly trying to restrict anyone. They were more interested in opening up a space for other voices. But as a result, is there an implied expectation that in banning non-Indigenous writers from this subject, Indigenous writers are expected or urged to write on the subject. Are they saying to that group that the prawns are for you, now come and eat them? I promised I wouldn't go back to the smorgasbord, but I have. In theatre, the default playwright is undoubtedly white and male. The prototype was established by Shakespeare and was consolidated by Chekhov, Ibsen, Strindberg, Brecht, Beckett, Pinter, Bond, Miller, Stoppard, Williams, Albee, Bennett, Ackborn, Friels, Kushner, and so on. The prototype is white and male, and everybody else is an exception. Carol Churchill, arguably the most important living playwright, remains an exception. Here in Australia, the prototype holds, even though our most performed contemporary playwright is a woman, Joanna Murray Smith, and our most awarded playwright is a woman, Patricia Cornelius. The prototype remains white and male. I fit the mould. I'm a playwright. Patricia and Joanna are women playwrights. That is how they have been described. That is how they've been published. They've been published in that context and discussed critically in that context. Why? Because a space needed to be created for them, a particular context needed to be created in order to overcome the structural bias against women. Nakia Louis is described as an Indigenous playwright. Mary Ann Butler is a regional playwright, and so on. This clearly reveals that the structural bias continues. There is the playwright. Think of him. He's wearing jeans. He's probably wearing glasses. He's got grey hair if he's older and a scruffy beard if he's not. But yeah, he's a playwright for sure. But this prototype has been challenged, particularly on the question of gender and race. There are spaces being marked out in which some playwrights are more qualified to enter. That's all that's going on, and I welcome it. When I'm working with playwrights in a mentoring or teaching capacity, I ask them to tell me the thing that they fear most as a subject, and then they tell me, and I tell them to write about that. I think writing requires courage, and it requires risk, and it involves confronting your fears. And so the thing that I am most afraid to write about, and therefore the thing I should write about, is race. I've written about race 3 times. In each case, it has been in an historical context. But the work of the dramatist differs from that of the historian. The latter examines history to reveal how things were. The playwright uses history to reveal how things are. A historic drama serves little purpose unless it sheds light on what is happening now. 2 of these 3 works are allegorical. The first was Holiday. Set on the white frontier in an almost mythical landscape, it tells the story of an Indigenous woman who was accused of taking a white child from a mission. She is brutalised by white men and held captive as they attempt to force her to confess to the crime. She is clearly innocent, but she refuses to speak in her own defence, for to do so would be to acknowledge the legitimacy of white authority on this land. So she maintains her silence and uses it as a political tool against her accusers. Without a confession, there is no clear solution to the mystery of the missing white child. In the end, she takes her own life rather than being scapegoated for the supposed crime. The action of the play culminates in the massacre of an Indigenous family group, and the bodies are burned in order to conceal the crime. The play premiered in Adelaide at the Playhouse in 2001 and was directed by Rosalba Clemente, who had encouraged me to develop the work from a rough draft I had written a decade earlier in 1988, the year of the bicentenary. It was produced again by the Sydney Theatre Company in 2003, directed by Ariette Taylor, and has since been done by student groups, including a production at Carnegie Vanguard High School in Houston, Texas. Amazing, Texas, who would have thought? The production was criticised by some Christian parents and groups for its depiction of sodomy and rape. There were moves to close it down, but the students bravely persevered under the direction of their loved drama teacher, Mr. Savage, and they went on to win the 2016 High School Theatre Championships. Sometimes you've just got to stop and tell those stories and acknowledge what drama allows and what courage it inspires. I love those kids for not giving in. The second work was called The Chair. This was a part of a larger work called Fever, co-written with Patricia Cornelius, Melissa Reeves, Christos Chalkis and Irene Vella. It premiered in 2002 in Melbourne and was directed by Julian Marek. When the lights rise, a colonial white woman stands watching a near-naked black man who is bound to a chair. We learn that she has found him unconscious, with his ankle caught in a rabbit trap. She has dragged him inside, bound him to the chair, and tended his wound. Now they are frozen in mutual fear of the other as they wait through the long night for the husband to return. The woman is faced with a choice: to let the man go or to keep him bound, knowing that the husband will dispatch him on his return. As their tentative conversation unfolds with the little shared language they have, she tells him the story of the chair he is bound to. Her grandfather, the white settler who first opened up this land, made it from the skins of the indigenous people he murdered and had taken the land from. The young man is literally wrapped in the skins of his ancestors. The original owners of the land had been made into furniture. It was a disturbing metaphor. The third work was The Secret River. Adapted from the Kate Grenville novel, it tells the story of William Thornhill, a supposedly good man who participates in a massacre of the Darug people in order to secure his holding of land on the Hawkesbury River. Like in Holy Day, the bodies are burned to hide the crime. The play was directed by Neil Armfield for the Sydney Theatre Company and premiered in 2013 as a part of the Sydney Festival before touring to Canberra and Perth. It returned in 2016 to Sydney before touring to Brisbane and Melbourne, and returned again to an outside performance in the Anstey Quarry in 2017's Adelaide Festival. Clearly, across the three works, there are recurring themes of white violence perpetrated against Indigenous people, of murder and massacre and genocide being used as a deliberate means by which the land could be claimed and the actual owners dispossessed. This is a story that I've returned to for a reason. For me, it is one of our most important national narratives about who we are as a people and country. Its importance resides in the fact that it counters another national narrative that is based on the lie of Terra Nullius, and that the settlement of this continent took place as a peaceful and heroic act of nation building. I don't deny that took place, but to say that's the only story is dangerous. As a country, we are still fighting these two opposing narratives. Our history remains contested ground. The Secret River has proved to be the most successful of these works. It seemed to act like a national catharsis in which white Australia was confronted with the sins of the past. It was as if something denied had been named at last, and its power seemed to lay in the collective act of witnessing the horror of it. At times, it felt like a ritual cleansing. But Secret River was not without its critics. It was not a cathartic experience for everyone. Specifically, it was not cathartic for Indigenous people. It was traumatic. It was unsettling. It elicited in some a response of anger and suspicion. I was made acutely aware of this response on a panel session I did after the performance of the play in Melbourne. On the panel with me was Rachel Mazza, Tony Birch and Rolf de Heer. Rachel had been critical of the play in a speech she made at a recent theatre conference, and so the panel had been convened to discuss the points she raised. The atmosphere in the room was tense and confusing. Whilst the white people sat at the front, they felt emotional and sought to acknowledge and explore how the work had affected them. The Indigenous people sat at the back, and their anger, and the anger of some of them was tangible. A number of them made statements that challenged the work and my right to tell such a story. Our right. At first I thought to defend or explain the work. I was upset that it had caused this response, blindsided a little. I shouldn't have been. Finally it became clear to me that I shouldn't talk, but I should just listen. The comment that affected me the most was the final one of the night. A young woman said, "How could you do that? How could you end the play like that, with that white man standing over one of our brothers like that? How could you humiliate him? How could you humiliate us like that?" Hearing this, I realized that this young woman had seen the play through very different eyes than mine and through a very different experience. At the end of the play, time jumps forward several decades. Nyalamallam, a Darug man, enters and sits resolutely on the earth by the fire. He has survived the massacre but bears both physical and the psychic wounds of it. William Thornhill is now a prosperous landowner. He approaches Nyalamallam and tries to move him on. He tells him to go up to the house to get a cup of tea, plenty sugar and some tucker from the missus. He offers him his old coat as the nights are getting cold. Nyalamallam refuses the charity. Thornhill becomes irritated. Perhaps Nyalamallam's presence reminds him of what he has done. Come on, move on, move on. You can't just sit around here like a bludger all day. He takes Nyalamallam's arm and the Darug man roars, "No!" And then he quietens and he touches the earth with the palm of his hand and he says, This me. This my place. The intention of the end was to say that despite what has been done, Nyalamallam's connection and belonging to the land is irrefutable and unshakable, as it is for all Indigenous people. And that while Thornhill has prospered materially, he bears the heavy burden of guilt because of what had been done. And it's making him sick. The power, the moral force in the scene is held not by the supposed victor, but by the victim. This is what I saw. This is what most white people saw. But the young woman saw humiliation, defeat, trauma, and an annihilation of a culture and a people that denied her very existence. All three of these plays require Indigenous actors to reenact the trauma of genocide. Every actor on these shows is prepared to do that in the belief of the importance of the work. But it is not done without cost. All actors in a play like Secret River pay a kind of price to tell that story night after night, but the burden falls most heavily on the Indigenous actors. I watched Ursula Jovic struggle in rehearsal to end the play as the narrator, and I listened as she respectfully questioned whether she wanted to continue to play out this trauma, this damage, primarily for white audiences. And I saw Ningli Lawford struggle with her emotions as each night she has to reenact and describe the massacre in the same role that Ursula played, Dirabin, the narrator. Everyone worked with dignity and commitment and professionalism, but at times there was suffering off stage as well as on. Neil Armfield always understood this and always remained sensitive to it. But we had kids in the show, and Neil had brilliantly orchestrated their innocent play as a kind of counterweight to its darkness. The boys' water fight, Dick's learning of how to light a fire, the sharing of knowledge between black and white, the easy sense of connection between the kids hinted at a different possibility and therefore made the eventual end, even more tragic. And so I'm left asking, as a white writer, do I have the right to ask Indigenous actors to continue to play out this trauma for the benefit primarily of white audiences? I don't actually know the answer. Rachel Mazza has questioned this. Her criticisms of the play mattered to me. I respect her as a senior figure in our artistic community as the artistic director of Elbidgery Theatre Company. But I also consider her a friend. We go back a long way, right back to Holy Day, in fact. Rachel played the accused woman, Linda, in the very first production of the play here in Adelaide. I can still hear her resonant voice and see her fury in this speech. I will speak, and all of you will listen, because this is what I've got to say. I took your child. I went to that mission, and I took that child with its pale skin and its fair hair. I picked that sleeping baby up with its sweet face, and I took her away. And I went down to the waterhole, and I held that baby in my arms, and I sang her a sweet song. And she opened her eyes and looked at my face, and she smiled. She, a little white fella, smiling at a black face because she didn't know what the rest of you think of that face, how the rest of you hate that face, how you're scared of it, how you bash it, how you kick it, how you push it into the dirt. That baby didn't see anything in that face but the smile I was giving her right back. Then I took that baby and I walked to the water and I kissed her face, and then I held her under. And I felt her go tight at the cold, and her little hands reaching and her eyes looking up at me through the water. And I held her there and thought of every white bastard that's walked on our country, and I laughed at the lot of you. Actor and playwright need to work closely together in order to make that kind of material work. There's mutual trust and belief required. It's a contract of sorts. So yes, what Rachel thought mattered. Her full critique can be found online. But one of the more difficult things she said was that Secret River was not the kind of play she wanted her son to see. That's the story, not the story she wants to tell him. And I can understand this. Rachel wants her young son to see a different kind of story. Stories about survival and resilience, and stories that celebrate a living culture. I know the kind of play she means. I saw Nathan Maynard's The Season at Noarlunga Theatre recently, and it was a joy. And a few years ago, I saw Jack Charles versus the King at the same suburban theatre. These works are affirming and important and celebratory. Both have toured this country. And the important work of Big Heart and Bangara, of course, and Nakia Louie and Leah Purcell, who are telling their stories their way. This work acknowledges and celebrates the centrality and vitality of First Nations people in this country. And it is created and driven by Indigenous artists. I understand why Rachel wouldn't want her son to see Secret River, but here's the dilemma. I want my children to see plays like Secret River. I want all white children to see the play. I want to see it studied in schools and discussed in the context of our history. Because it wasn't so long ago that these events were hidden behind a veil of silence. The first time I read about an Indigenous massacre was in my third year of university in 1983. And it is still the case that prominent historians and politicians in powerful positions of influence seek to minimize the significance of this history or even deny it. And that needs to be challenged. And the best way I can do this is through the power of the plays I write. And so how do we reconcile these conflicting needs? Well, it's not hard. We need both kinds of narratives to sit side by side. We need to ensure that Indigenous writers and theatre makers have access to our main theatres and to mainstream audiences as well as to regional audiences. And we need to continue to collaborate whenever we can. We need to continue to get into the rehearsal room and to work it out. We continue to challenge one another and to make work together. Now is not the time to step back into our own corners and to close the door to one another, because the fight for the soul of this country continues. My vehicle is tragedy and trauma. Other writers use humour to great effect, but I walk into the darkness. I don't even understand what compels me to do so. Holy Day is unrelenting and unforgiving in its depiction of frontier violence. The play seems preoccupied with the myth of the lost white child, just as we are as a country, but there is another narrative that sits alongside it, one that we have been reluctant to embrace to the same degree. It's the story of the stolen black child. Nora, the woman who took her, gives her the name Obedience. As the play unfolds, we witness her struggle to return home to where she belongs. The only information she has is that she remembers the sea and that it was the same colour as the sky, and she knows that she comes from the coast, at least. Nora refuses to tell her the name of her mother or the place she took her from. Then I have a tongue and I will use it, the defiant girl says. And she takes her battered suitcase and she starts to walk back. On the way, she witnesses a massacre. A rise above the river. Obedience stands looking down to the river plain below. She holds her battered suitcase. The sound of gunfire builds to the screams of people fleeing and the panic and terror of a massacre. Obedience turns and walks slowly to the front of the stage until there is silence. It was dusk. The women had come in from gathering and had lit the fires. The children had been with them. They stayed down at the river to play in the last of the light. A group of older men were sitting near a large rock, talking about the activities of the day and about what would be done tomorrow. They would move on from this place soon and join a larger group for ceremony. Some of the younger men had gathered around the fires to see what the women had brought in. They were hungry and looking forward to the meal. One grandmother was angry and telling them to wait. Someone looked up and pointed. A white man was coming down the hill towards them. The women started calling the children. Two older girls ran to the river to bring them back. The old men got up and moved to meet the white man. They understood that he was afraid and was trying to warn them. They heard the shots coming from the other way. They looked to see a group of 8 white men on horses crossing the river. The 2 girls that had gone for the children were the first to be shot. Several younger children fell quickly after. The women ran towards their children and were shot in turn. The men ran for their weapons and were cut down. One woman grabbed a small child and managed to hide her in the bush. But when she went back for another, she too was shot. When the full brunt of the shooting was over, 22 people lay dead. 12 of them were children. Another 14 were injured. 8 had managed to escape in the bush. The old woman had been spared, too old to run and too old to shoot. She sat by the fire and wept. The white men got down from their horses and shot the wounded. They made a pile of the bodies and set it alight. There was one white death, the man who had come to the camp to warn them. This is our history. Soon after, she is set upon by the itinerant convict Nathaniel Gowndry. He rapes her and then he cuts out her tongue. He then takes her battered body back to the Traveller's Rest and dumps her at the door. It's so brutal. Nora cradles her. "What have I done?" she says, because it was her who sent Gowndry after Obedience in order to bring her back. What have I done? I remember that Aubrey Mellor, then artistic director of Playbox in Melbourne, wrote to me after reading the play and urged me to reconsider the end. "You need to leave people with some hope," he wrote. I refused to change it. Instead, we had Obedience rise unsteadily to her feet. She walked to the end of the stage and looked out into the desert, still determined to make the journey home. She refused to lie down. But she no longer had a voice with which to ask her way. She'd been silenced by the brutality of a white man. And yet we sensed the strength that remained within her. This is the truth of our history. It is an ambivalent end. It asks the audience to finish the story. If I was to revisit the play, would I spare obedience this terrible fate? Would I let her find her way home and allow the audience to experience the emotional catharsis of that? Is the story of survival more important to tell at this time than the brutal representation of violence and trauma? I honestly don't know the answer. But I think that it lies within the Uluru Statement, and I urge you to read it. To conclude, I return to its final paragraph. In 1967, we were counted. In 2017, we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our trek across this vast country. We invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. Thanks for listening.
Andrew is happy to take some questions. We have just a few minutes for questions and discussion. So please, if you have a question, let us know.
I've got a comment. I'm amazed at how emotional I felt in giving that address. I'm surprised that this still presses buttons in me. I've worked with this material for a long time, but it caught me unawares. I think I'm tired. It's been a long day. I'm a doctor. I'm allowed to be emotional.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrew. A little fact which may have slipped by in the address, that one does not have to have lived the experience to imagine it. I think you're alluding to that a lot. I heard Pat Barker speak on radio recently, English novelist. She's probably written the best novels about World War I. She's a woman. She wasn't in the trenches. And yet she imagined and researched and identified with that scene, those events, so well that she takes us there, as I think your plays and films do too, with many thanks. So I just say to you here that you don't have to have lived the experience to write it well, whether male, female, or whatever. And that's, I think Andrew was possibly mentioning that as well. Thank you again. It's more a comment than a question.
I think Pat Barker is a great novelist and is a great storyteller.
Can I ask about... Oh, sorry, I have a question over here.
Yes, I don't want to say this to contradict or alter or say something different from what you've been saying, but the thoughts that have gone through my mind have been that we are all one species. So the convict who committed the crime, the violence that you described, had himself suffered horrible violence as a convict. And that the settlers who came to Australia included the survivors of the Jewish genocide. That we are not on the one side perpetrators and on the other side victims. We are a human race that needs to do something about itself.
I think that's a really a true comment, and the play includes a character called Samuel Epstein, who is Jewish and very much an outsider. And it also contextualises Goundry's violence. all 7 characters in the play are exiles. They are all disconnected from the place they belong, including the 2 Indigenous people. Every white character in the play is there against their choice. It is not their choice to be there. They are either economic refugees or they are convicts. So I take your point, and I believe the play absolutely gives us an insight into what a man like Goundry comes from and why and how a man like him projected his own trauma upon the Australian landscape. That too is a part of our history.
You mentioned history there. I'm an historian. Secret River, I think, began as a history and turned into something else. What do you think's more promising in terms of achieving what we need to achieve? Is it drama? Is it fiction? Is it history?
Well, I think the relationship that they complement each other. Kate's book was criticised by particular historians because, from an historian's point of view, it seems as if a novelist is saying, this is what happened, this is how it happened. Where I don't think Kate ever claimed that. Kate claimed that this is an act of imagination that is informed by very careful research into her own family and into the times and into the circumstances. So it is not an uninformed imagination. But clearly they do different jobs. Henry Reynolds has been so important in terms of telling the story of the particular history that I too have drawn on. And in fact, his book, his body of work has been the first port of call for people like me to come to try and understand that. So, and hopefully, and Henry actually came along to Secret River, the play, and he wrote a foreword for its publication. So there was a beautiful kind of dialogue that took place between him as an historian and me as a writer of fiction.
Thank you. There are no further questions. Sorry, there is one more question. We'll take one more.
Yeah, no, so earlier you were talking about representing brutality and also trying to navigate the space between what stories you're supposed to tell, what stories you've been expected to tell. How do you, as a storyteller and as a creative, navigate the very business side of it? You were talking about getting Indigenous voices on the mainstream stage, getting other voices on the mainstream stage. How do you do that? Because people don't want to see those stories a lot, and they're not very profitable. And how do we kind of break out of an independent model into the mainstream? I think that's probably my question.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point that you make, but I think that landscape is shifting. And there have been some groundbreaking works in the last 2 to 3 years. So particular Indigenous writers have been developed, have been supported as they are building their works to a level that they can hold audiences in the main stage. I no longer think it's the case that audiences are not interested. So one of the most popular and commercially popular works is a play by Nakia Louie called Black is the New White. It's had a hugely successful season. Have I got that title right?
Yeah.
Yeah. A hugely successful season at the STC. It's been brought back. It's about to go on tour. Leah Purcell has done a reimagining of The Drover's Wife, in which she writes the Indigenous characters back into the landscape and back into the story from which they were written out of. Again, a highly celebrated and attended work. There are Indigenous writers on every main program, main stage theatre program, I think, at the moment. This is a huge shift. It's happened in the last 5 years, but it's been talked about, the need for this. So the space is being created, and as soon as the space is created, there are the writers to fill that space, and that's happening. So I actually feel quite optimistic.
We need to close there, but I just, from the floor, as opposed to my MC, I'd just like to also chip in support of that. That one of the most successful Australian theatre works to tour the world in the last little while was Stolen, which more people internationally have seen as an Australian play than any other I can think of. But the other important thing is the Indigenous visual art scene, which is internationally so hugely, so that representation is getting better. But it is. I'll now go switch over to MC. Do you know? Andrew, I just really want to say thank you so much. I was at Playbox when Holy Day was premiered, and I was there at its opening night, and I remember Rachel so clearly in that moment as well, and Mandy McElhenney and so many others. And I think that, the contribution that you make and continue to make to the political and artistic and cultural dialogue in our country is so important, and we are so fortunate to have had you here tonight, and I'm so thrilled that you chose to speak about what you did, and thank you so very much. Yes, please. And on behalf of Flinders, this has been gift wrapped by someone in Paris, I think. It's very glamorous. Happy doctorship, and thanks for being here. And it only remains for me to say thank you very much for being here tonight, and please, whatever you do, exit carefully. Thanks.